Thank you all. Welcome everybody to this event with Keshet and Jews for Secular Democracy and the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Before we start, if everybody could rename themselves, so go into the top right corner, add your name, your pronouns, and then in the chat, we'd love for everybody to continue to introduce themselves, sharing where you're calling in from. And then a question that we have for all of you is this your first time engaging in activism? And if it's not, how did you get involved? So in the chat, let us know if this is your first time, or if it is, if it's not your first time, how you got involved in activism work.
I saw someone had their hand raised. Was that an accident or does somebody have a question?
Oh, accident.
Okay, no worries.
While folks are typing in the chat, Shannon and I will introduce ourselves, and then Paul and Sarah will as well. So my name is Jon, I use he him pronouns. I am Keshet's Director of Community Mobilization, and I'm calling in from Miami, Florida.
And hello, everybody. My name is Shannon Saul. I use she and they pronouns, and I am Keshet's Community Mobilization Manager. I'm excited to see in the chat that we have both first timers and folks that started back in college in the late 60s. If you didn't quite get a chance to see the prompt, if you could share in the chat if this is your first time engaging in activism, or if not, how you first got involved.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Golin. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and our initiative is Jews for a Secular Democracy. And I'm in Brooklyn, New York.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Levin. I am the Director of Strategy at Jews for a Secular Democracy, calling in from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you. So for those of you who this may be your first time hearing about Keshet, Keshet is the nation's leading LGBTQ Jewish organization. We're working for full LGBTQ equality in Jewish life and in the entire nation. Keshet does three things primarily. One thing that we do is youth programming. So we create gender and sexuality affirming spaces for queer youth, queer Jewish youth, with weekend programming. And then we also do education and training work, going into synagogues and organizations to help them work on their inclusion work. And then what we are here to discuss tonight is Keshet's community mobilization work, which is our advocacy and organizing work through the Jewish community for LGBTQ rights.
And Jews for a Secular Democracy is an initiative galvanizing the Jewish community to defend the separation of church and state in order to counter the influence of religion on government and policy. And I'm going to let Sarah do most of the speaking for us today because she's great at it. But I do just want to say that this is a pluralistic initiative, meaning we want to bring the full spectrum of Jewish belief and practice and experiences and denominations to this initiative, but it is an initiative of Society for Humanistic Judaism, which is not pluralistic. It's one of the denominations of American Jewry. And if you haven't heard of it, we're not going to talk about it today, but please Google it. If it's of interest to you, I'm happy to have you involved. So I'd welcome you. And I do want to put in a plug for those of you who are coming in through Humanistic Judaism or Jews for Secular Democracy. And I see a lot of you, and it's great to see you. If this is your first exposure to Keshet, I will just say this is an organization I've admired for literally 20 years. They do amazing work. They are amazing people. Their values and activities and vision is 100% aligned with both Society for Humanistic Judaism and Jews for a Secular Democracy. So if you haven't yet been involved with Keshet, get on their email list and follow them and see the stuff that they do because they're awesome.
Thank you, Paul. That was a very flattering plug for Keshet. I also just want to apologize if the slides are delayed in switching. It looks like they take a minute after I click next. So if they're delayed, that's why. I also just wanted to mention that we may or may not have time for a formal Q&A at the end. So if you have a question while we're presenting, please feel free to stick it in the chat or to raise your hand at any time. So just a quick run through so you know what to expect today. We're already cruising through this agenda. Look at us already past the introductions. And then I want us to talk about why we're here today. We're going to talk about why inclusion and taking action are a part of our Jewish values. And then I'd also talk about why church-state separation is important and a part of our Jewish values. We're going to talk about the landscape of the policies and where we stand today. And then finally, at the end, we're not only going to tell you how you can take action, but we're all going to take action together, which is very exciting. And for those of you who this is your first time, don't worry, we'll totally walk you all the way through it.
Some of the goals that we have for the next 50 minutes or so together are to explore the Jewish values that guide our thinking on why it's important to take action, and to contextualize the fight for LGBTQ rights through the lens of a church-state separation. We're going to learn about the different forms of activism and why it's vital for Jews to have a voice in these causes. And we're going to examine the current state of the laws that we're going to talk about. And then, as Shannon said at the end, we're going to actually all take an action together.
So just want to lay some ground rules or intentions for us in this space today so that we're all coming knowing what to expect. We really encourage folks to be open in this space. We are all learning and growing together. There might be some new things you learn about. We encourage you to ask questions about them and to stay open to them. We also want folks to take whatever they learn from here and take it with them. If you learn today how to take action or maybe a new technique for taking action, feel free to take that from here. But if anyone shares any personal stories, we ask that you keep those confidential in this space. We also welcome that we're all at different places in this learning. And so if someone slips up and says something that maybe they don't exactly mean, we're going to be totally forgiving of that and know that we're all learning together. We would love you all to be active participants, as you're already doing a great job of sending your responses in the chat, raising your hand if you have questions, or sending them in the chat as well. And then we also know that some of these topics can be uncomfortable, and we're going to move through that together. We know that we're talking about topics that might not come up in your everyday life. And if you're uncomfortable, that's okay. That's what learning is about. And then we also ask that you stay present. We know that this is Zoom and we're all Zoom fatigued at this point, but if you can be present in whatever way that looks like for you, we really appreciate it. So speaking of active participation, if you all could write in the chat for me what you think of, what comes to mind when you hear that taking action for LGBTQ rights is a Jewish value. Maybe what does that bring up for you? Is that surprising? What thoughts do you have? Is that something you've heard before? I'm excited to hear what folks have to say about this. Tikkun Olam, definitely. That is a value that drives our work at Keshet and at JFASD every day. All social justice is Jewish value. I love that, Kathy. Acceptance, Dan, totally. We're going to talk about acceptance and inclusion and how we move that into taking action for sure. Anything else folks want to contribute before we move on? Feel free to keep sending things in the chat and definitely want to recognize them, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to keep us moving along.
So we just posted in the chat a link to the PDF resource, which is this slide. So these are Keshet's 7 Jewish values for an inclusive Jewish community. And we're not going to spend too much time on all of these individually. But if one of them in particular is popping up or feeling particularly relevant, feel free, plug it in the chat, and we can dive deeper into it. But yeah, we don't want to spend too much time on this with everything else that we have on the agenda today.
So I'm going to take on this slide. You may not typically hear LGBTQ rights in the same sentence as separation of church and state. One of the things we really want to emphasize and have you all come away with is that that absolutely LGBTQ rights is a church-state separation in so many different ways. First of all, when it comes to the folks who are trying to take away rights from LGBTQ folks. They're using a very narrow version of religious liberty that isn't true religious freedom, but a version of it that privileges a very narrow set of beliefs over everybody else's to undermine civil rights. And just to back up for a second to remind you, where do we get church-state separation from? It's the First Amendment. The first line of the First Amendment says that Congress shall not establish an official religion. I'm paraphrasing, but that the establishment clause is the first line of the First Amendment, and that means that the government cannot establish an official religion, can't push one religion over others, and can't establish religion over non-religion. So it's that First Amendment that guarantees religious freedom for people of all faiths and people of no faiths. And that means that the government has to be neutral on matters of religion and can't codify specific beliefs that don't represent everybody on all Americans, because that would violate the First Amendment. And so we know that a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the arguments for religious liberty, using religious liberty to discriminate on the basis of religion against LGBTQ folks it's coming from folks who think that they have a right to codify a very narrow set of beliefs into law. So restoring separation of church and state and defending and advocating for it not only protects LGBTQ folks, but also everybody, right? Because if you can discriminate on the basis of religion, you can discriminate against anyone for any reason. Because once you have, and another example here is religious exemptions, you could pass a sweeping new law at the state or federal level that protects folks based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But then if it has a religious exemption, it's a massive loophole. And once you have a religious exemption as a loophole, you really can't have, the state really isn't in a position, nor really should it be, to distinguish what is a valid religious objection or what is a correct or acceptable religious objection versus a invalid or a less correct one, right? Because that puts the state in a position that it's not supposed to be, where it's saying this is an okay religious belief to have, but this isn't. And so having a more neutral approach of putting civil rights first and what people should have, the right to do according to their own conscience, rather than having religious exemptions that put the state in a place where they're kind of choosing winners and losers, is really the right way to go. And so what we're seeing is religious exemptions. We're seeing really an approach that sees often faith-based organizations seeing taxpayer dollars as an entitlement, that they are entitled to have access to taxpayer dollars, for example, to provide social services, and then to turn around and use that funding and then discriminate on the basis of religion. And they say that they have the religious liberty to do so, right? So we're seeing this in foster care, we're seeing this in adoption care agencies. I'm sure you've seen some of this in the news even recently. But the idea that taxpayer dollars, which we all pay into, would go to organizations or institutions that then think they have the right to use the funding that's supposed to benefit everybody and then discriminate on the basis of religion. This is how religion or religious liberty, in quotations, and the erosion of church-state separation really impacts and erodes LGBTQ rights. And the last thing I'll say on that very quickly is that in a society, in a country where separation of church and state is really strong, same-sex marriage would have never even just been an issue, right? Because the definition of a specific denomination or collection of denominations on what constitutes marriage shouldn't be relevant in a society where the government administers marriage, right? You can have religious ceremonies that define marriage however they like, but the secular community has really for a long time been supportive of same-sex marriage, because it just doesn't even seem, if you come from that perspective, there really shouldn't be a religious definition of marriage, which has so many civil rights and privileges that come with that institution that is run by the government. And so just, one example of, why it's so important to defend separation of church and state. And I'm going to turn over to Paul for this one.
And one of the reasons why we wanted to do an initiative that brings the entire Jewish experience to separation of church and state is because, for the most part, this idea of the government being neutral about religion has enabled Jews in America to thrive in a way that we haven't, I would argue, in any other diaspora community in the 2,000-year history of Jewish diaspora. And sure, there are lots of issues still, but overall, we are the most successful diaspora Jewish community. And it started, from the very get-go. George Washington wrote a letter to congregants at Toro Synagogue, very famously promising that you would not be discriminated against as Jews. But that hasn't always been the case. So the example we have on this slide, the Immigration Act of 1924, was discrimination. It was anti-Semitism. It gets muddled a little bit. We can use it as advocacy to say this was religious discrimination. But when we do that, we can also acknowledge that Judaism is more than a religion. It is more than an ethnicity. It is more than a race. We're not even considering ourselves a race anymore, but we were considered a race in the 20s and 30s. This just came up in the past couple of weeks with Whoopi Goldberg, which is a separate webinar conversation. But certainly there's a religious component to it that we can now recognize and say, when it happened recently with the quote unquote Muslim ban, no, we were there, that happened to us. We're not going to let it happen to anybody else. And I think there was a widespread anger about a Muslim ban from most Americans. Unfortunately, a minority of Americans hold more political power. But even the courts overturn that. And what I'd like to suggest is that there's a piece here beyond just the courts, beyond just legislation, beyond just lobbying your local representative, all of which are important activities. There's a value, there's an American value that I'd like to appeal to as Jews toward all of our fellow Americans, to say, this is about freedom and fair play, right? These are American values that should be baked into the DNA, and it's literally written into our Constitution about what is fair toward other religions, about who is making decisions for other people. So we know what it was like to be excluded from these shores when we needed to come here most. We knew what it was like to be restricted in terms of the neighborhoods we can live in or hotels we can stay at. This is our own. Some of us may remember it, or for some of us, it may be in our grandparents' lifetime, but this is within living memory. These discriminations happened for Jews. Today, the front line of church-state separation is women's rights, reproductive justice, and LGBTQ equality. And Jews overwhelmingly support equality and these issues. And I just want us to recognize that there's this opportunity. This is an additional tool in our toolkit for bringing change to the country by pointing out what's written in our Constitution and the value behind it of separation of church and state. The secular in Jews for Secular Democracy is not telling anybody how to believe, it's telling our government how to act, which is neutral toward religion.
Thank you both for that great backing, that background for us. I just want to take a minute and talk about the questions in the chat while I let you ponder this question. If you can think of some examples, if I said, I'm taking political action, what do you picture me doing? If you could put some examples in the chat, I saw someone already did, but what are some ways you think of that fall under taking political action? And while you all are thinking and typing, I just want to say, Matthew, thank you for that great question. We know that in Jewish texts, there are at least 6 different genders, and Jon posted a really great resource from our resource library in the chat for you all. I really encourage you to look at our resource library in general. We have lots of great resources, and if you want to dive in even further, you can request a training from our education and training team at Keshet. We're happy to dive into those issues further with you, even though we don't have time today. So I see that Jon put in the chat Hal's responses from earlier. Those are all really great examples: attending events and actions, contacting elected officials, associating and working together with other groups who are marginalized in our society. I see Susan said communicating with your politicians. We're going to do that today. working to change organizational policies and practices. Totally, Lydia. There are ways to take political action that may not even involve the larger political or electoral system. There are totally political actions within our smaller organizations and communities, definitely. So you all already gave some of these really great examples. There's a few that weren't on your list, and I'm sure there's a few that aren't on our list, but things like attending a protest, testifying in front of your state legislature, volunteering with Keshet and JFASD, that's a great way to be politically active, talking to your neighbors, posting on social media, talking to your synagogue, similar to how Lydia mentioned working to change organizational policies and practices. That might be one way that you do that. And I see that folks are putting even more examples in the chat, which are wonderful. I'm loving how engaged you all are, so I appreciate that. So let's talk about the current state of LGBTQ rights. So as you can see on this map, in the majority of states, it is still legal to discriminate against someone based on their gender identity or their sexual orientation. We will be sending out this presentation and this recording afterwards. So if you can't capture all of this information right now, totally don't worry, Michelle. I anticipated that question, but I just wanted us to get a quick view and a quick understanding of the fact that it is still legal to discriminate in most places in this country. So why does Jewish support specifically, sorry, alliteration, for LGBTQ rights and non-discrimination protections matter? So no one should face discrimination because of who they are, who they love, or where they live. But unfortunately, in a majority of states, LGBTQ people still remain vulnerable to discrimination, and people are really suffering that harm. And we know that often religion is used as an argument against LGBTQ rights and protections. And that's why it's so important for us to speak up as Jews and say that it's not despite our religion that we support LGBTQ protections, but it's because it's a part of our religious values and our ethical mandate to do what is right. And LGBTQ non-discrimination is extremely popular. Paul kind of previewed this a little bit earlier, but surveys show that the vast majority of Americans, no matter their party, support LGBTQ non-discrimination legislation like the Equality Act, which we're going to talk about in a minute. This majority support holds across all party lines, the vast majority. So what is the Equality Act? This is one of the pieces of legislation that we're going to be taking action on today. So the Equality Act is a bill that's currently in the US Senate that would update the Civil Rights Act to prohibit discrimination, like I said, is still legal in many states, on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. This covers areas like employment, housing, public accommodations, public education, credit, the jury system, anywhere that we might consider the public sphere, places where people are out in public interacting with others, trying to access services, that kind of thing. So passage of the Equality Act would protect people no matter where they live from discrimination. So this is really important because right now, like I just said, it is really dependent on where you live. And it's really unfortunate that where you're born or where you grow up or where you move for a job can impact how you are treated and what is legal about how you are treated. Yes, Eric, a lot of people are surprised by that 68% of Republicans, but it's true. And actually more people support non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people than they do marriage equality. So people are really, really in support of legal protections against discrimination. I also just want to add that if passed, this Equality Act would prohibit RFRA, or the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, from providing a defense for discrimination. So currently, folks can use religion as a scapegoat to say that it's against their religion to not discriminate. So we know that we need the Equality Act because religion shouldn't be a license to discriminate. I also just want to mention in terms of where the Equality Act is, it is currently in the Senate. Like I mentioned, it passed the US House already. It actually first passed the House in 2019, but it passed the House again in 2021, and it is currently sitting in the Senate waiting for a full floor vote. Do Do I have any questions about this slide before I move on? I see Jay sent me a message saying that it's going to be difficult with a 50-50 Senate. And yes, totally agree with you. And I want you to know that our efforts are not in vain, because every time that these senators are hearing, especially from religious folks, because the other side is, they're hearing a lot from religious folks. Every time they hear from us, they tell us that it really makes a difference that we came and talked to them. And they're getting thousands of calls every day from people opposing the Equality Act. So the more we can do to contact them, the better. Hoping I'm not missing anything in the chat. I'm just making sure I covered everything. Will the Equality Act have to be passed again by the House after? Yes, it will. So with the new Congress, it would have to be passed again by the House. Each session, it would have to be passed again until it is passed by both houses of Congress. Matthew, that is a great question. The answer is both. We are working on the Equality Act at a national level, and we are working on state level protections as well. I really encourage you to stay tuned on Keshet's community mobilization efforts. We have lots of state-based events going on this year, as well as national events. So we're tackling it from both angles. Ultimately, we would love the Equality Act to pass so we don't have to focus on this at a state by state level, and the more states we can get on board, the better.
So I mentioned earlier that LGBTQ rights are typically not thought of as a church-state separation issue. I want to encourage you all to think even more broadly than that about the kinds of issues that you might really care about and how they relate to separation of church and state. So all of these issues here listed here tie into why it's important to have a secular government. Like Paul said, we're not talking about secular in the sense of pushing non-belief, but secular in the terms of government maintaining a separation between religion and government, being neutral in all matters of religion to protect religious freedom for people of all faiths and no faith. So Paul mentioned the example of the Muslim ban. We're also going to talk a little bit about white Christian nationalism in a bit. But that's really tied into sort of this nativist resurgence that is very xenophobic and anti-immigrant. Women, reproductive justice and women's rights. That's really about, for example, when it comes to banning abortion or severely undermining access to abortion, that's coming often from the perspective of personhood, a very narrow belief about where life begins. And that's fine, of course, to believe that and hold that view, but not all Christians and not all Jews and not all people of faith, not all Americans share that view, which is deeply personal, right? And to codify that view into law is to not just violate the bodily autonomy of people, but it also violates religious freedom because it's imposing a very specific religious view on all Americans, despite the fact that they may have their own views about this. And we talked, of course, about LGBTQ rights a bit, having taxpayer-funded discrimination through, for example, adoption and foster care agencies that are receiving federal or state dollars, and then only, adopting or assigning or only adopting and working with foster parents who are of the exact same religious tradition, despite the fact that there might be very caring and loving same-sex couples, interfaith couples, Jewish couples who are just as qualified. And that's really obviously a disservice, not only to the citizens who are paying their tax out, the dollars in, and then being discriminated against, but of course the children who deserve a loving family. Access to secular education is also connected to this church-state separation issue, and to should definitely be of concern to the Jewish community. We have in Florida, for example, over $1 billion in the state budget going to mostly private religious schools that in addition to not necessarily having to, serve everyone equally like public schools do, they can teach that the world is 6,000 years old. They can have policies that don't allow students to be openly LGBTQ. And in some cases, they are teaching really problematic material about Jews and about Black people. It's really, I didn't include anything in these slides because we don't have time. But you would be really shocked to see the kinds of things that these schools are teaching, and also what they're not teaching. We work on, for example, in New York, making sure that all New York children have access to basic math and science, which unfortunately is not currently the case. There's over 60,000 kids in New York who are not learning basic English, science, and math from schools that are actually receiving taxpayer dollars. And then, of course, the climate crisis, science denial, and, the undermining of scientific institutions goes hand in hand quite often with Christian nationalism, which, again, we'll talk about what that really means later on. But we wanted to share this with you so that you can think really more broadly about why church-state separation. It's not just this kind of amorphous constitutional principle. It's not in isolation. If you think about all the ways that Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy and just the imposition of religion have found its way into every single area of policy, even just with LGBTQ equality. Shannon mentioned, housing and employment. It touches everywhere, which means that protecting separation of church and state really does protect so many different communities and touches so many different issues. And now let's talk a little bit about the current state of church-state separation. I know I've touched on a few of these, so I'm not going to go through each one. But I do want to particularly highlight Project Blitz. It goes by a different name now, but it's basically a group of Christian right organizations that are blitzing legislatures, state legislatures, with bills that further their agenda to really codify their beliefs into law. And it's really important to note that a lot of their rhetoric, they are claiming Judeo-Christian values in the process, although they're supporting an agenda that, as was mentioned earlier, the majority of American Jews do not support. But yet they are invoking our name, our community's name, to justify their agenda. Often they start with things like "In God We Trust" bills, which if you live in Florida, you'll remember that was passed into law, which mandated that all public schools prominently display "In God We Trust." They start with bills like that because they're often seen as harmless. They don't do anything, right? But the purpose of that is to really reinforce this idea that we are a historically Christian nation, which of course we're not. And the ultimate goal of their agenda is to have the broadest possible religious exemptions from non-discrimination laws and the broadest possible access to taxpayer dollars that they can use and then discriminate without any repercussion. So in addition to that, I'm sure you've all heard by now that the courts at every level, not just the Supreme Court, but at every level, we have courts being stacked by folks with these views. And it's also very important to note that Christian nationalism played a major role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Prominent Christian right leaders and media pundits were really feeding into the big lie. And there was a lot of Christian imagery, and the Christian flag was waved and prominent at January 6th. There were folks saying prayers, as they broke into the Capitol. And I want to just super quickly, because I know I've used the term a lot and I realize I haven't actually given you a definition. I'm going to pop into the chat. I think this is a really great resource and great organization or coalition called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And I'm not going to read the entire statement here, but basically the way to think about Christian nationalism is that it conflates the idea of what it means to be American with a very particular type of Christian belief. So it really blends, nationalism with a certain brand of Christianity, promotes this idea that we are a Christian nation that should be basing our laws on a certain narrow view of Christianity, which of course undermines LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, and so many of these other issues. And the Do No Harm Act, so kind of tying together what I was saying before about thinking broadly. So Shannon talked about the Equality Act, and luckily, if passed into law, the Equality Act would roll back the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I'm just very briefly going to give you some background on this. Some of you might remember the Hobby Lobby decision years ago. This was the case where a Hobby Lobby, which is a huge craft store chain, challenged the contraception mandate that was in the Affordable Care Act. And they were using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed in '93 by a really broad coalition of groups that did not intend it to be interpreted the way that the court did. And basically the decision, unfortunately, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court basically said, broadly expanded what RFRA was meant. And it became like a kind of get out of jail free card that allows religious beliefs to trump the law. So it's created this huge loophole. And since its passage, unfortunately, in '93, and since this decision, it really laid the groundwork for some of a lot of the chipping away of civil rights that we're seeing and separation of church and state. And what that case was about birth control. It was about, saying that, yes, Hobby Lobby as an employer, they can impose their religious beliefs about birth control on all of their employees, despite the fact that those employees have their own religious beliefs or lack thereof, right? They should be able to make those decisions according to their own conscience. But, you don't apply for a job and ask, so what's the company policy on birth control? What does the boss think about it, right? But that's essentially what we're saying here is that, yeah, your access to health insurance, if your boss, your employer happens to have a religious belief that's contradictory, you're just not going to have access to that. But that case was about birth control. But what it said and what the result is that any employer could invoke RFRA for any reason to get out of any law whatsoever. And so you might be wondering, well, why do we need to pass the Do No Harm Act, which would amend RFRA to say that you can't do this? It would basically say, roll back that Supreme Court decision through legislation. Why do we need to pass the Do No Harm Act if we have the Equality Act? And the reason is because the Equality Act would address how RFRA impacts the LGBTQ community. But remember that just like with church-state separation in general, we really, and someone earlier in the chat said that, my Jewish values lead me to care about equality for everybody, right? We really don't want to live in a society where corporations and institutions that don't like a law that protects women, that protects LGBTQ people, that protects religious minorities can just be thrown out the window by invoking RFRA. And so if we want to protect not just the LGBT community, but everybody from this really broad ability that that corporations and employers currently have to discriminate on the basis of religion against anybody for any reason, then we need to pass the Do No Harm Act. And the Do No Harm Act actually, while it has a lot of support and a lot of co-sponsors in both houses, it has not passed either the House or the Senate. And so today, because you're already going to be calling your senators, you're going to ask them to support the Do No Harm Act and the Equality Act. But I'm also going to throw in the chat a way for you to contact both your representative and senator for the Do No Harm Act, because we do need both.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Before we move into this, I just wanted to take a moment to answer Bill's question. You asked, how do you reconcile advocating for LGBTQ rights on the basis of Jewish values with separation of church and state? That is a great question, and I can see on the surface how you might see a contradiction there. But what I want to emphasize is, just like Sarah covered at the top, freedom of religion is really about being able to practice all religions without the government's interference. And just like how I talked about earlier, supporting LGBTQ rights isn't in spite of our religion, but because of our religious values. And if we are going to have real religious freedom in this country, Jews need to be able to practice our religion, meaning not discriminating against LGBTQ folks. I hope that's a helpful answer. Please tell me if I can clarify that any more for you.
Can I add a little bit to that as well?
Go for it,
Paul. A
Paul.
little bit of my own answer, which is that, yeah, and this speaks a bit to what Sarah was saying with the Judeo-Christian values, right? It's so frustrating to me to see these religious fundamentalists cherry pick a line from our Torah, right? And then say, this is what God wants, right? When the Jews don't even believe that, when the Jews have had this long history of reinterpretation and conversation about our own religion. But the other thing is that the Jews don't agree on it. Overwhelmingly, they support LGBTQ equality. But as far as like where that source of those values are, we don't have agreement on that. And as a secular Jew, I would rather no religion play any role in this conversation at all. But what I would take to the debate is we don't agree as Jews, and we're just 2% of the population in America. The Muslims don't agree with us. The Christians don't agree with us. The atheists don't agree with us necessarily. So look at the totality of it. And that's the argument for, I don't want the government deciding among us, right? Let's work it out for ourselves. Let's do what's right for ourselves. The government should be neutral. And a neutral approach to this is, if you don't want to marry someone of your gender, don't marry someone of your gender, right? And that's it. And that's your religious freedom. And then if you do, that's your religious freedom, right? And so I take it as, let's celebrate the diversity of viewpoints and bring that to the argument too, rather than saying, well, you're wrong because here's what our Bible says. And that route has not been successful. I don't see it, but it's just my opinion on that.
I would add just one more quick thing, which is that there's a big difference between saying, I support this policy because I'm inspired by my religious beliefs or my ethical values to take action on this. And there's a big difference between that and saying the policy should be this because the Torah says this or because the Bible says this, right? You have people of faith and non-religious folks and people of different faiths coming together, reaching the same conclusions, coming from different inspiration, but the ultimate argument they're making isn't it should be this way because our scripture says so. They're inspired by their scripture to act, but that's very different than saying our law should be based on scripture, right? There's nothing wrong with having your faith or your values inspire action. That's of course what inspires action and really informs people's opinions. But that's very different from saying that the law should be based on your specific, religious beliefs.
Thank you both for adding. I hope that was helpful to answer your question, Bill. Please let us know if you want us to clarify any further. And now we get to the fun part where everyone gets to take action. So again, if this is your first time, please do not worry. We are going to walk you through this. I also just want to plug, Sarah posted in the chat, and I'm about to also send a link in the chat that you can use. Sorry, I clicked on the link by mistake, that you can use to take action if you would prefer to write an email, write a letter, something like that. But this is the script that we are all going to use to take action today. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to demonstrate taking action for you all. I'm going to go through finding my senator's number. I'm going to leave a voicemail while you all are watching me, and then I'm going to set you all free to do the same thing. So this is the link that everyone is going to go to. I will put it in the chat. You all can still see my screen, correct? All right, so I'm going to put in my zip code. All right, so I'm going to start with this first senator. So I can see there his phone number. So I'm going to go ahead and dial it. And I'm going to use my handy little script to tell him what I'm calling about. Sorry, y'all, it's ringing. This is the magic of real time. Also, you should expect to get a voicemail and not a person, just so everyone knows.
Please feel free to leave a message at the tone or call back again. You may also contact us through our website at bennett.senate.gov.
Hi there. I am a Jewish constituent and supporter of Keshet and Jews for a Secular Democracy, and I am calling to urge Senator Bennett to support the Equality Act and the Do No Harm Act. The Do No Harm Act would amend the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to ensure that it cannot supersede civil rights laws, employment law, protections against child abuse, or access to healthcare. The Equality Act would amend the Civil Rights Act to prohibit discrimination based upon gender identity or sexual orientation in all 50 states. This matters to me because I identify as LGBTQ and I should be able to go anywhere in the US without being afraid that I can't stay in a hotel room or go to school because of who I am. I hope that I can count on Senator Bennett's support of this critical legislation. Thank you. So it's that easy. I would say, yes, you can definitely expect a voicemail, usually even during the daytime hours. They do really pay attention to our calls. They, like John said in the chat, they keep track of who calls for and against every single bill. And that's why us calling makes a difference. Lydia, you are welcome to look up if they already support the legislation. And if you want to call and thank them for their support and encourage them to continue supporting it, totally great. That's an extra beyond step. You do not have to do that. The more calls they get in support also will encourage them to bring it to the vote. For example, the Equality Act, we've been waiting for the Senate to bring it to a vote for over a year now. So the more calls they get, even if they're already technically going to support it and vote for it, tells them that it's an urgent matter and that they should act on it quickly. Does anybody have any other questions before I set you all free to make those calls? Great question. The word Keshet means rainbow in Hebrew. And LGBTQ folks love the rainbow, so that's why. I will definitely put the script into the chat and I'm going to leave my screen up. So while you all click on that link and look for who your senator is, I'm going to leave this screen up so that you all can read it. Does that work, Sharon? It's also in the chat now.
Also remember to replace congresswoman or congressman with senator for Congress senators.
Yeah. And we do have one additional slide that we will send out after this with, if you want to go above and beyond and also call your representatives, just because the Do No Harm Act is also waiting on a vote in the House. So you would just be calling about do no harm in the House, but that's an extra step after this you do not need to worry about right now. So I'm going to leave this script up. I will resend that link in the chat to find your senator's contact information. And I am going to go ahead and mute myself and set you all free to make a call. Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have a question for us. And as soon as you make your calls, you are welcome to stay on for our closing or to sign off for the night. But we really, really appreciate you all being here if you don't stay. And your taking action is really important.